Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I'm your host, Robert Stanley. Did Jesus Christ really resurrect from the dead? Here we go.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
TJump, better known as TJump, has his own YouTube channel under the name TJump. He's been on the show many times. And Caleb Jackson, I went on your YouTube channel, which is named, it's a horrible name, Caleb. What is that? Proselytize or apostatize? Did I say that?
You just call it Pora. Yeah, that's probably a
Pora. That sounds cool. Pora.
It does, yeah. I didn't come up with the name, so I'm not taking responsibility for the mouthful of the word. But yeah, Pora is just an easier way to
not your fault. Caleb Jackson, he's also an author. 2 books, impressive. One is called Undead, and the other is Searching for a Solution to Suffering. You can find that on Amazon. Is there a website you directed them to as well, or is Amazon fine?
No, Amazon is fine for now.
Fantastic. So I wanted to ask you something, Caleb. How do you know Jesus resurrected? And I was hoping Tom could help pick it up thereafter.
So yeah, I guess we'll start with that. So I wasn't planning on anything overly formal as far as openings and stuff like that. So I guess we'll just lay it out with a few opening factors and just kind of see where the discussion goes from there. So yeah, I think that from the other debates I've seen on this discussion with Tom and stuff, that most of this comes down to more of a debate on epistemology as far as, do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Is testimony justified, or can testimony ever be justified in affirming a miracle? And what kind of testimony are we really looking for more extraordinary claims? And so I think the first thing that should be discussed is what kind of criteria should we be suspicious of? Or sorry, what kind of testimony should we be suspicious of, and what kind of criteria should we have to vet some of those out? So we should ask, for example, is the claim very far removed from the original source of witnesses? Was this written down hundreds of years later by people second, third, fourth hand? How many witnesses do we actually have for the claim? Was this one person with a private revelation, such as Muhammad with the angel Gabriel, or do we have many groups of people? Was this a public event? Is there already expectation and willingness to believe from those who espouse it, or is this something that's contrary to already established ideals? Was there persecution? Was there investigation? Was there skepticism? Or did the people telling these stories already believe them without second thought? Is there any physical evidence left over? If it's a modern day thing, do we have photographic evidence or medical evidence? Or is there no physical leftovers that we have to work with? Are there any unexpected features from a narrative that might be surprising or embarrassing, or something that we wouldn't expect from someone merely inventing a story that may have certain elements of verisimilitude and certain elements of truth to it? And is there a decent prior probability to this, or is it so improbable that this would hurt the initial plausibility of it? So I think those are some criteria that are at least fairly objective, that shouldn't be determinant on one particular religion, such as it's not criteria like, well, the Pope has to espouse it or something that seems very arbitrary. Something that's more general in epistemology. And now when we look at the resurrection claim, of course, giving a brief case, most people will do some kind of minimal facts approach. I don't think that's necessarily for this, but I think we can try to look and see, does the resurrection claim and other Christian miracles like it that may be entailed with it fulfill some of these criteria? So, the earliest claim we have the resurrection comes from a creed that from Paul. Paul was initially a skeptic who had converted, and Paul was in correspondence with people like James and Peter, which he mentions in Galatians 1 and 2, where he had gotten this information from, who were also claimed to be eyewitnesses. So we're not very far removed from the initial sources on that. As far as witnesses go, Paul lists several dozen, some of which he knew personally. This is more than just 1 or 2 people seeing an event, so that raises the probability slightly. Is this a unique belief that countered normal ones? Well, yes. In Judaism, typically it was not believed that a single person could resurrect from the dead prior to the end of the world. They did believe in ghosts. They believed people could be taken up to heaven, but the belief that a single man could be raised was quite arbitrary. And this was something that from both Paul's letters and people like Tacitus, Christians were persecuted because they were not very popular among the Romans for beliefs such as that, because they saw it as contrary to many of the divine attributes given to the Caesars, for example. So we do have somewhat persecution in that. Do we have any physical evidence left over? Well, some people would argue that the Shroud of Turin is. Now, I'm not an expert in that, so I wouldn't personally bring that up today. But that's something some people bring up. I think a better one would be maybe the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which many archaeologists think could plausibly be the site of the empty tomb, because there's plenty of archaeological reasons for thinking that it's a pretty early veneration site. And even if we can't know for certain, and even if we could say, well, that there's no body there, that doesn't automatically prove the resurrection happened, but it does at least add on to the analogy that we're doing. It adds a little bit onto the cumulative probability case. Is this unexpected? Is this something that we would have reasons to be skeptical of as far as preconceived notions? Well, again, this appears differently than how it would be expected. Most notably, in the Gospels, Jesus appears unrecognized and not even not conforming to what the Jews predicted the resurrection would look like. In Daniel 12 and other passages like 2nd Baruch, the resurrection is supposed to be this glorious and luminous appearance, and this is not what we get in the tradition. So this doesn't seem to be derived from the Old Testament that we would expect someone who is hallucinating, for example, to have that. And of course, we have to ask, like, is there a probability for this, or is this just so initially improbable that we can't really expect to find it plausible? Well, there are philosophers like Richard Swinburne and others who argue, for theism, and also argue that there are good reasons to think that God would become incarnate and atone for sins. And of course, those reasons are a bit complicated to get into as well. But there is serious consideration as far as prior probability goes. And the last thing I'll say on this is that I think the initial idea of miracles, especially contemporary miracles in Christian context, are actually quite frequent. In fact, there was one survey in 2004 that showed that 55% of American doctors believe that they had personally witnessed a miracle, and 75% of them believe that they were open to the possibility. And so it's extremely common as far as how common these beliefs are, especially by people who are educated by doctors and the like. And we have medical bureaus and papers and stuff published attesting to many of these. And so I think this notion of supernatural intervention in many areas of this, especially tied to the resurrection, tied to people praying on the name of Jesus, who, if Jesus is still dead, it's quite surprising that people are able to be healed in his name, whereas if Jesus is still alive, it's slightly less surprising. I think all of that needs to be taken into consideration of the initial probability. And that's kind of what we're, I guess, here to discuss and look at today. So with that, I guess I'll conclude that informal opening.
Well, Tom, I'd say you just lost the whole debate. What do you think, man? Is any of that kind of convincing for you, or did you find any of it challenging, perhaps? I didn't like the last part. What was it? Where the
Shroud of Turin?
Yeah, the Shroud of Turin. That one threw me. But he didn't want to go into it, so that's fair, because he said he wasn't an expert on it.
That's more Dale Glover's thing. I just brought it up because some people do, but that's not
old
something
Dale Glover.
Defend, so.
But the miracles claim, I thought was probably the weakest of all. But maybe your strongest point is just the witnesses. Would that be fair, Caleb?
That would be fair.
I actually think his strongest point was in the beginning when he said, like, the conversation is mostly about epistemology. I think I agree with that. I think that it is about, like, he said that we start off with epistemology and trying to determine what sources of information we are suspicious of. Well, that part he got wrong. So we actually start off with trying to determine what sources are credible. First, we assume they're all not credible. They're all garbage, and then try to find out which ones are credible, not the other way around. And then discussing whether or not we should trust a testimony. Yeah, absolutely, that's the case. And whether or not what criteria could make some testimony more or less reliable or likely to be true. That's also, those are the most important points here. Like, if testimony isn't a reliable source of information, well then, okay, resurrection lost, because that's all you have is testimony. So really the debate is about, is the testimony reliable and how could it be reliable? The testimony itself from the Gospels isn't really that interesting. It's more just people claim to have seen a dead person. And he mentioned that one of the factors that he thinks that makes testimony more likely is whether or not someone in a culture is likely to believe it. That's not quite correct, because there's extraneous factors that explain the same thing. It's whether or not there is some feature of reality which causes the same phenomenon to occur, which we know of, which would cause them to likely believe it. And there is. So, like, if all of the Gospels or the apostles saw a dead loved one, well, that's a really common thing in humanity called bereavement delusion. It happens to 30 to 60% of people. If a loved one dies, they see them and hear them dead after they've died. This is not a rare thing to occur. So Are they likely to believe that they saw and heard a dead loved one? Yes, that is a very common thing for humans to believe, regardless of what their cultural proclivities are. So really the question isn't about are they likely to believe in their culture? It's, is there something that can explain the phenomenon that we know of, which isn't a resurrection? And is that a better explanation? The answer is, well, yeah, that's a significantly better explanation, which is why testimony isn't taken as evidence in courtrooms or in history for anything that doesn't already have an empirical basis. Like no miracles, magic, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, none of that can be justified by testimony in a courtroom or in history, because we know testimony is so unreliable. We know for a fact. We start with just this. It's not a priori, it's a posteriori. We know testimony is garbage. It cannot be used to justify these things. You would need the testimony can be used as a basis to build a hypothesis, and that hypothesis can then be tested with like actual science, empirical things that can verify it. But the testimony itself is just garbage, just a just so story or hearsay. It's not a reliable source of data at all. So I don't know why he thinks that testimony should be considered special in this case, 2,000 years ago, from a bunch of goat herders who didn't know anything about science, when we don't do that for even modern testimony. We know modern testimony wouldn't count. If that many people said they saw Jesus dead today, would that count as evidence of Jesus' resurrection or Bob's resurrection? No, it would not. It would be irrelevant. We'd say, okay, well, we're going to need some evidence here. Like just your words don't do anything for us. So somehow the testimony being provided 2,000 years ago, being treated as if it's somehow more reliable, is a conundrum among the Christian community. Like, well, what are you doing? Like, would you trust like a bunch of neighbors down the street who said that they had a friend rise from the dead? Like, obviously not. But somehow you're willing to trust a book from thousands of years ago.
Caleb, that's a good question. Would you believe somebody if they said they saw someone resurrect now, even if it was what was it, like a dozen people maybe?
Well, I guess it depends on the question. Are you saying would I believe a single person telling me this, but live next door to me? I mean, that's I would have to say it would depend on the context of it. But we know, people can be revived from the dead. I mean, that's not as far as revived. I mean, I know of doctors who have pronounced people from the dead and then hours later raised them from the dead. Now, that's not necessarily analogous to supernatural raisings, but certainly testimony from credible witnesses, I think, is relevant. But that's why I tried at the beginning to have these factors that would vet out.
Well, let me clarify that a bit. Yeah, so sure. Let's say that there are thousands of people in Russia who say they are in the presence of the resurrected Jesus. Mm-hmm. Thousands. This is not one or two. They all have testimony. They have all eyewitness claims. They all claim to have gone through miracles. They have seen the dead loved ones. Mm-hmm. Are you going to believe them?
Yeah, I guess in that scenario, I would probably say it would be some kind of mass hysteria just based off of that information if we didn't have anything else to go off of.
Okay, so what is it about the gospel testimonies that makes you want to believe them? Because from my perception, it seems like the gospel testimonies are infinitely less reliable than the Russians that are alive today. Like that seems to be better evidence than the gospels. So if you were going to establish some kind of an epistemic basis to compare these two, like it presented them in a court of law or whatever, mm-hmm. the Russian testimony would be given more credibility than the Jesus testimony.
Well, it depends on the factors. So I would say with the Russian case, I don't know if you would have the kind of persecution you would have. I don't know if the Russian government is jailing these people or trying to kill them or whatever. Why does that matter?
Why does the persecution add credibility?
Because it would mean that it's less likely that the individuals are being deliberately dishonest. They could be They could be honestly mistaken. But in the Russian case, you could say that these people are lying, where it's less likely in the former case. But
that's saying negative evidence. So like if we're saying if we want to know if X is in the box, and we can say, well, we know X isn't my knife because my knife is here, so it can't be my knife. Well, that gives us absolutely no evidence to what is actually in the box. So saying it isn't a negative case doesn't actually provide any positive evidence that it is in fact true. So simply saying that, oh, well, we can know they're not deliberately lying doesn't actually provide any positive evidence that it's true. So it doesn't add to the credibility of the testimony. All it does is it doesn't negate from the uncredibility.
Well, it eliminates, or at least it makes less probable, one of the ulterior options. So that's more what it is. It's not saying that therefore they're not lying, therefore it's true. You can have other options of, well, they think they think what they saw was real, but they're just they're being mistaken. Right. That's possible too. I'm just saying.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. That's why I brought up the knife example. So if there's a box and we want to know what's in the box, and I say, oh look, I'm holding my knife, so it can't be my knife. I've eliminated one of the possibilities. But that tells us nothing about what's in the box. That is not positive evidence to conclude anything about what's in the box. So if I said, I imagine it's a unicorn, I imagine there is a unicorn in the box, and I'm going to say the evidence that there is a unicorn in the box as well, it's not my knife. It is definitely not my knife. So I've eliminated one of the possibilities. It can't be my knife. Therefore, does this add credibility that it's a unicorn?
Right, but I don't think we disagree on this particular point. All I'm saying is that the difference is in the Russian case. You were asking me what is the difference between the Russian testimony and the gospel testimony. I was saying, at least in the case of the earliest Christians, I would say that deliberate deception on their part is less likely than it could be in the Russian case. I'm not saying that therefore the Russian case is deliberate deception. It could be. I would think it'd be more likely honest mistaken by a mass hysteria. But if you're
that's my point here is that's an irrelevant factor. It's like saying, well, they're in Russia. The Russian testimonies are in Russian. The Jewish testimonies were in Israel. Like, that's nice, but that doesn't tell us anything about which is more likely to be true. From an epistemic standpoint, they are both equally as uncredible. Or, well, actually, the Russian one would be more credible. The fact that it's located in Russia or located in Israel doesn't add or take away to the credibility of either side of the argument. So the thing you presented as a factor does nothing to the evidence to add credibility to one or the other. It's irrelevant. It's like saying, oh, they're Russians, or they're Israelites. It doesn't change anything. So the point I'm making here is the factor you brought up, the fact that they could have been being persecuted and that they may not deliberately be lying, is irrelevant. Like, it doesn't add credibility to the claim. So epistemically, if we're in a courtroom and we're saying which one of these is true, that would do nothing. That would count for zero evidence one way or the other.
So you don't think you could rule out? So you don't think you would say that the Russian ones are also lying? I don't think it matters.
It doesn't matter. Like, I don't care. Like, so I can say, if we're saying, like, what's in the box, and I say it's a unicorn, you say it's a pixie or whatever, and you say your evidence that it's a pixie is, well, you see, it's not a knife. I know it's not a knife because I'm holding a knife in my hand. I'm like, and I don't make that claim. Let's say I don't make a claim that it's not some object in the room. Does that make your claim more reasonable because you've eliminated one of the alternatives? Well, no, because again, you're providing negative evidence. You're saying it's not this other thing. But that doesn't provide positive evidence to the truth of the claim. So what we need to show that there's a difference epistemically between the Russian claim and the Jewish claim is some positive reason that actually indicates the truth of the claim. It can't eliminate alternatives. It can't be a negative evidence. It has to be a positive evidence.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't think you can argue for miracles just saying, well, we've ruled out all natural possibilities, therefore it's a miracle. It's a combination of providing positive evidence and negating natural things. So
what is the positive evidence that differentiates the Russian testimony from the Jewish testimony?
Well, for one case, when we bring up like bereavement visions and stuff like that, these don't lead to belief in bodily resurrection. They lead to belief that the person's dead and they're seeing their ghost, but that's not necessarily analogous to someone saying, yes, my dead grandmother is actually walking out of her grave as a corpse in that sense. So that would be
happened many times in history, but so that's again negative evidence. So you're saying that in today's society where people know that bereavement delusion happens and they're most likely crazy or they would think they would be crazy because ghosts don't exist, and scientific consensus doesn't exist, therefore seeing the bereavement delusion doesn't cause them to believe in ghosts, is irrelevant because, I mean, in most societies prior to science, seeing a dead loved one, you would think it's a spirit or a ghost. That's a very common thing. So again, this is irrelevant to the argument. What you're just saying is there's a societal difference in the way that they interpret psychological features, but that doesn't matter to the argument here. So whether or not the Russians in Russia think their bereavement delusions are true or I guess your argument actually work in favor of the Russians. So because the Russians are less likely to believe that seeing a bereavement delusion would correspond to an actual person because they have more availability of the current science. Whereas back in the past, they are less likely to think it's going to be some psychological feature. They're more likely to think it's a spirit or a ghost or an actual resurrection because they have less access to the science. So by that criterion, if we took it seriously, which I don't think it counts as anything, but if we took that as an actual piece of evidence, it would lend credence towards the Russian testimony and take away credence from the religious testimony, from Jewish testimony.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that. I'm not even trying to compare it as so much with modern examples of bereavement visions. I'm saying even back in the day, we have plenty of ancient examples of people seeing ghosts and bereavement spirits in that case, including Jewish examples. So I'm saying that what they were saying was contrary to the social expectations of their day. That's more what I was getting. Not even just compared to that. Even
right. I can agree. I can agree with you in general, but today the Russian testimony is even more in contrast to the society. So in modern society, seeing a ghost, because we know of all the psychological features, we know of the science, it is even less likely today to convince someone that that is an actual ghost than it was in the past. So if that argument is a credible argument, which I don't think it is, that would be more evidence for the Russian case than the Christian case.
Well, but in the Russian case, you'd have to look at Russian Orthodoxy is already an established religion. People already believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead if they're Russian Orthodox. And so this would be a belief that's consistent with the opinions that are already established in that culture.
But it would be contradictory to all of science. That's the part that matters here. So the fact that it could be in line with some beliefs doesn't matter to the argument. So we can say in Jewish beliefs, they believe there are souls. They believe other people raised from the dead, like the previous resurrections that I forget what happened in the Old Testament. There were some resurrections that occurred. So it is consistent with some of the features in the Bible. Therefore, we can use the same argument to say, well, oh, since that would make it not contradictory to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So that would, again, not actually give any positive evidence and would also work equally or better for the Russian case.
Yeah, but I'm trying to articulate this because I'm not sure that we're necessarily understanding each other. I was saying that in the Russian case, this is not a belief that is contrary to what people in that culture already believe, whereas in the Christian case, it is contrary to what's already believed. And so when you're looking at psychological expectations and religious expectation and so forth, that's going to be a major distinction between the two. That's kind of what I was trying to preliminate there. As far as Jewish
I understood what you're saying, but that's what I addressed. I said that's false. So it could be contrary to some beliefs. So obviously the Russians believe Jesus is resurrection, so they already believe in resurrections. Mm-hmm. You're saying that the Jews at the time did not believe in resurrections at the time.
Yes.
I'm saying that no, they can use post hoc reasoning and look at the Old Testament resurrections where God rose people's souls and talked to them and stuff like that and say, yes, we do believe we can justify resurrections. Now, what my comparison was is that their knowledge of science would be contradictory to their belief in resurrection. So they may have some beliefs which would be consistent with, and other beliefs like science that would be inconsistent with. So if your argument is that in the society, is it likely for that group to accept bereavement delusions as a resurrection? Because of science, the probability they would accept it is low because we have lots and lots of science. And we know what this is. Psychological features are very common. So if you have basic knowledge of science, the probability you would accept a bereavement delusion as real is lower today than in the past for them, for the Russians. And in the past, you can say it's lower for them because they didn't believe in resurrection as much. They had one less resurrection in the Jewish Old Testament. Therefore, they were less likely to believe it for that reason. That's fine. But again, if we were going to accept this as evidence, it's not. This is completely an irrelevant factor that makes no difference one way or the other. It would still lend more credence to the fact that the Russians were true because it's more likely in today's society that you will not see a bereavement delusion as being true. And it was more likely in the past that you would see a bereavement delusion and think it was true because of science. Now, there could be other factors like religious factors, but those are significantly less likely to have an impact than the scientific knowledge of today.
Yeah, and I guess I would push back a little bit as far as, the pre and post scientific age. Certainly we have more advanced science in this day, but it's not as if people back then just were just completely accepting of miracles and didn't think that this was unusual. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of miracles is that they're supposed to contrast. In fact, you can't really have miracle claims be consistent if natural laws don't exist at all. That's the whole point, is that miracles are an intervention of natural laws. And so even today, millions and millions of people, especially, the vast majority of them, in the third world especially, do believe that have witnessed stuff like this. And so I would be hesitant to say that the acceptance of miracles is less frequent today than it was back then, because then that's why I was trying to quote doctors and stuff like that, of saying even people who are well educated in medicine and so forth do believe they have still seen miracles even with their scientific background. I don't see any contradiction between miracle claims and science, because science and natural laws.
Just to clarify, I'm not arguing against miracle claims here. I'm arguing against specifically bereavement delusion. So specifically seeing dead loved ones. Like I think the facts show that people believe in miracles less often today because they're more atheists. But in general, specifically just about bereavement delusions, because we have lots of psychological research on this, lots of papers published, this is a very common thing. It's on the news. We know what this is. Lots of people know what this is. This is a common feature that we know about in reality. If someone sees a dead loved one, they're going to look back at their prior knowledge and be like, oh, science has explained this as a bereavement delusion. I can just go to a therapist to talk about this, rather back in like thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago even, when we didn't have the research on what a bereavement delusion was, they're more likely to think, oh, I'm seeing a dead loved one. That was more common in the past, and more common that people would believe in spirits and ghosts and talking to dead loved ones in the past than today. Not just miracles. I'm not talking about miracles. I'm talking about specifically interpreting bereavement delusions as actual seeing a ghost.
Yeah. Before you answer, Caleb, I worry we might have beat this dead horse a little bit more.
It can be resurrected if it's been beaten. Though.
Yeah, we don't want to resurrect it. But,
no,
Is your claim, just to wrap up that part of the questioning, is your claim actually, Caleb, that people were more likely, or that people would be just as likely now as they were in the past to believe in, miracles and ghosts and goblins and ghouls and whatnot? Or is that somewhere that he kind of just, would you say he led you down that road and you ended up defending it inadvertently, or is that actually what you think?
Well, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers as far as back then. Certainly there are more atheists today, so
they're not just atheists.
Statistically,
just generally speaking, it doesn't seem like that would be something that I would want to be defending if I were in your shoes. I don't think that's really what you think. I'm sure you believe
that people still claim miracles today, or
the people in the past believed more fake shit than they do today. And you can say, well, some of the stuff that Robert's describing as fake shit is stuff that I actually believe in as a Christian. Fair enough. But I'm just saying, generally, of course, people believed in more of that stuff.
Oh, sure. I think people believe in it today and back then. I mean, if you're going to say, I do think that was common. But you see, even people back then, like, I'm trying to think, I think it was Pliny the Younger, Pliny the Elder, had a whole essay on Alexander the Quack Prophet of people scamming it. And they were very critical on this. Tacitus is very critical on miracle claims. So it's not as if you didn't have skeptics back then who disbelieved these as well. So I think as far as, the ratio between skeptics and believers, I don't know if that is significantly different back then than it was today, maybe slightly. But certainly I think the disbelief in the supernatural, even among atheists, a lot of polls and I think Scandinavia and elsewhere have them believing in ghosts or something like that. I think general human experience is quite optimistic towards belief in the supernatural and its agency within natural law and how it intervenes in it. So I think the initial premise that natural laws are, immutable and that the supernatural doesn't exist, and as far as interacting with natural laws, I think that uniform human experience throughout history and even today, it would the majority of it would seem to counteract that, at least as far as initial intuitions.
Well, that's kind of a separate point here. So the argument I'm making was that in today's society, it is less probable for an average human being to believe a bereavement delusion was actually a ghost than in past societies. In past societies, if you had a bereavement delusion, you are more likely to think it was a spirit than today. Average person.
Sure. And I mean, there are plenty of average people who do think that they're still ghosts, but sure, I'll concede that because I think that's probably right.
So if your argument is that they are less likely to think a bereavement delusion is a ghost, and because they are less likely, that is evidence that it's more reasonable that it's true, then it would be better evidence for the Russians today, because it's less likely they would believe the bereavement delusion was true than for people in the past. Therefore, if your argument is that because it's less likely they would believe a bereavement delusion was an actual resurrection, and they do, then something special must have happened to convince them, then this would apply more as evidence to the Russians today. Also, I wanted to just quickly mention your claim that miracles can't happen, or that all there is natural laws, and somehow most people's experience contradict that. Again, until you can show testimony actually counts as evidence, the fact that people would accept that or not isn't relevant. And I never made that argument. So I've never made the argument that the natural laws are contradictory to miracles. So those are separate topics, but just on the basic point of what you said, it's if the probability of people seeing a bereavement delusion and thinking it's a resurrection is low, if we count that as evidence, then it would be better evidence for the Russians. So your own argument seems to contradict your point and show that my counterexample defeats your position, because we don't accept the Russians, and yet this would be better evidence for the Russians.
Well, again, let me wrap this up, because I know Robert wants us to move on to something else because this is repetitive. But the one thing the thing that I was trying to say is that it depends on the background of the Russians. If these are secular atheistic Russians who don't believe in stuff like that, then I think your point would be correct. But if these are people who are Russian Orthodox who already believe that Jesus rose from the dead, then they wouldn't be as skeptical towards a bereavement vision, because they've already believed people have seen dead loved ones and that it was legitimate. So I don't think that that's I think that's an important factor to consider in this hypothetical scenario.
Hey, something I'm real curious about, Caleb, and this is a side thing, but miracles has come up a lot. And I would think Tom might be interested to know this as well. Do you believe in any miracles from other faiths, not Christianity?
Yeah, there are. I believe is a hesitant word. There are ones that I think that I can't really explain very well that I'm compelled by, that I think are fascinating. There's
I don't mean that. I mean, like, do you accept miracles happen in other religions as well as your own?
I would be inclined to say yes. Yeah. Same with Catholicism. I mean, I'm not Catholic, but yeah.
I don't know. When I was a Christian, it was always like that was demonic. Like we had, there was stuff that God did that was real and that was good and holy. And oddly enough, he never fixed anybody like an amputee, but it was always like a mysterious cancer or something, something you couldn't see, and then it would be cured, and that was God doing it. It's just more rare now than in the Bible days, is how I was taught as a child. But if it was anything outside of that, it was demonic. And Satan has special powers, and he can do things, but that's not necessarily what you ascribe to. You're actually saying that other people's religion, other people's gods, or I guess you wouldn't think it was their gods. Just explain that for me. I don't understand how other religions' miracles could happen in your worldview.
Try to steelman that. So I think Rob's question is do other gods do miracles for other people's religions? And I think Caleb would probably say no. He's just thinking his God is doing all the miracles for everybody.
Okay, is that fair?
Yeah, that would be fair. I mean, so I do know Christians who would try to use the demonic example, and of course, you do see some of that in the Bible with like Pharaoh's magicians, also copying some of Moses' miracles and stuff like that. But of course, that's ad hoc, because once you get to Jesus being accused of casting out demons in the name of Beelzebub, Jews might as well just say, well, that Satan raised Jesus from the dead to deceive the masses and convert people away from Judaism. So that is a bit of a slippery slope, I think, to try to say, well, it's all demonic and stuff. But yeah, I think that would, if one were to take that God is the one doing these, I would say that perhaps you could say that it is a single God. One could be a pluralist and say, many Buddhists don't have an issue with Jesus raising the dead, for example, because it doesn't completely contradict their own theology. One thing I do find interesting is that if one is to concede that some of these are supernatural, the difference in the Christian cases is that usually these lead to conversions in the third world, whereas typically, from what I've seen, the other miracles typically happen in camps where people already believe them. So you don't have large numbers of Christians, at least statistically large numbers, converting to Hinduism, for example, because they saw a Hindu miracle. Usually Hindus are the ones saying they saw a Hindu miracle. But we do have statistics and reports and data of Hindus seeing Christian miracles and then having whole tribes of people converting. So that to me seems to be going one direction. But I'm not saying that necessarily shows that the Christian God is the one doing this, but that's kind of the format in which I would look at some of those. So,
Tom, you've responded to a lot of Caleb's points. Is there anything that you would have that you would argue is good evidence that the resurrection did not occur?
Yes, our knowledge of basic human testimony and bereavement delusion. So the fact that we know people see other people they've loved died makes it far more likely that that's the case. Like if Jesus actually resurrected and he was seen by the Russians or the Romans, if he was seen by the Romans and had to be crucified again, that would be pretty good evidence that we'd be like, okay, well, did he resurrect, or was he did he just survive the first resurrection? That'd be really unlikely. So if the Romans had to crucify him a second time, that would be probably good evidence that he actually resurrected. So if the Romans were seeing him resurrect, that would be good evidence that it wasn't just a bereavement delusion by his followers or people who had an emotional connection to him. But because we don't see that, we only see this as claims by his followers. That's pretty good evidence it's most likely a bereavement delusion.
Yeah, well, that's actually interesting because that's kind of the work I'm working on right now. I have a whole chapter on modern visions of Jesus, and that includes visions to Hindus and Muslims and people who had previously no familiarity with Christianity. And so I think I actually agree with Tom that would be pretty interesting evidence if we had that. And I would say that in many cases we do. Also, in many of these cases, we have healings occur. So you have people recovering from things like cerebral palsy after Jesus appears to them and tells them you're going to be healed, and they're instantly healed. And we have medical records of this and so forth. So I think that is better evidence than the history. Not to say that history is not good, but I think that's entailed in the resurrection itself. If Jesus did not resurrect from the dead, it is surprising that people would still in different cultures would still be being healed and stuff by these appearances. Whereas if he did resurrect from the dead, it's not nearly surprising because, Jesus was a healer in his own day. And so he would just simply be acting the same way he did while he was still alive on earth. So I do think that is interesting evidence to incorporate.
So Tom's saying that it was just his followers that saw Christ, the resurrected Christ. Is that accurate?
Well, and Paul wasn't his follower. Paul was someone who persecuted Jews, but there's always somebody who had a very strong emotional connection to Jesus or to Christians.
But the Damascus Road was more like a fancy light Jesus or something. It was like the magical one, but it wasn't like the one, the same one, right? Am I remembering that correctly? Like the one that showed up right after Jesus died, like, Thomas put the fingers in the holes.
Put his finger in the holes, yeah, so that they were like physical, but Paul doesn't describe what he actually saw in his resurrection. We normally interpret that as being like a light or something. That's the most reasonable interpretation, but he doesn't actually describe what he saw. That's not in the Bible anywhere.
Cool. But Caleb, would you agree with that? We'll add Paul as a exception, but is that a fair point that he's making? That it was just his followers. It's not like, other people saw him.
Right, that's what I was bringing up. That's what I had just discussed in the previous comment. I don't know if I would agree with that. And in fact, Origen...
So Rob means just like during the resurrection story of the Bible, those testimonies.
Sure.
Only Jesus' followers.
Well, it depends if you count...
your argument was that, well, people also see him today, but that would be separate from the resurrection. Like, that wouldn't be... The fact that people saw him today wouldn't be the same as Jesus' resurrection. It's not like he's resurrecting again, right?
Well, he wouldn't be resurrecting again, but he would still be alive. So I don't see why that would be. Of course, every time he appeared, when he appears to disciples once and appears a second time, he's not resurrecting every time. He's simply raised and appearing to show that he is resurrected. So I don't think that it requires him being raised every single time. It's just as if someone was raised and was walking around and different people see him at different times. That doesn't require multiple resurrections. But no, you do have people like Origen in the 2nd or 3rd century saying, he mentions that like many people who were enemies of Christianity or who didn't know Christianity have converted by waking dreams and visions of Jesus. And that's something that you do continue to see today. So if you're saying the specific case of the 1st century, then yes, that's, as far as hard data goes, that would be correct. Although if you think the 500 appearance, we don't really know what those people believe. So that's that could be a potential exception, but we just don't know. But I would say that the stuff that we see today and in the centuries following is still relevant because Jesus would still be alive. And so that would be entailed, whereas we wouldn't predict that if he wasn't. So.
I don't think so. So I would say the visions today would make perfect sense whether or not he was alive. I wouldn't count the visions today or after in other cultures or whatever as evidence he actually resurrected 2,000 years ago. To get evidence he resurrected 2,000 years ago, you would need something from then. I don't think you could count, like, if we think about this from a modern court case example, we're trying to figure out, did Bob resurrect at the time of Lincoln? And we say, well, people have visions of Bob today. I mean, no one in the court case would be like, well, that's evidence he actually resurrected 500 years ago. Like, no, we need, in order for evidence that he actually resurrected, like a bodily physical resurrection, we need the bodily physical evidence. Visions do not count as that.
Right, not on their own, but of course those visions are not divorced from the claims of bodily resurrection from them. They're still entailed to it. And if these visions are converting people to Christianity, which as a principle holds to belief in bodily resurrection, if Jesus, for example, was just a ghost and was appearing to people and converting them to Christianity, it would be rather strange that he would convert people to believe something that about his bodily resurrection that wasn't true, that he didn't consider true. So
I don't think that makes much sense. So people convert to religion to believe all kinds of very silly things. I don't think the fact that if you have a vision of some God being, some supernatural being, and then you adopt all of the other ridiculous stuff in that book, like Tutankhamun or Tetmot Ra or something, just pick any God. You get a vision from the God, you convert to the religion. Now you believe all this kind of ridiculous stuff. This doesn't lend credence to the truth of all of the other stuff in the Bible that you saw a vision and then interpreted that vision to be true. So I don't. The logic of what you're saying doesn't seem to follow. It doesn't seem to be any evidential support that someone saw a vision of Jesus today and then was converted to believe to Christianity, and then because they believed Christianity, they accepted the bodily resurrection. That doesn't add any probability to the truth of the bodily resurrection. None of those things.
Well, if the vision was caused supernaturally by Jesus himself, then that would seem to be his motivation for it, And if his motivation was converting them for that, then that's more what that's entailed. But of course, that requires you to first think that these are supernatural visions, not hallucinatory. If they are hallucinatory, then
I believe that's called begging the question. So the whole point here is we're asking for evidence of the resurrection, which means like giving evidence of the supernatural would be a good first step, because the supernatural is real. Here are some kinds of supernatural things that occur. That would be a good start. But right now we have no evidence of the supernatural. All of the visions are bereavement delusions or psychological features explained by psychology. And so saying that, well, if it was Jesus who actually supernaturally showed himself to people, I mean, that's just begging the question. Like, we need evidence of that first. We need evidence is not just, it's a psychological feature in human minds that we know about from hundreds of years of psychology, and there's no supernatural or no evidence of the supernatural.
Well, it would be if the visions were not distinctly different than bereavement visions we see today. But if you're going to say that it's different in the sense that people did not have psychological prerequisites, didn't even know about this, or that they left some kind of physical healing that would not be otherwise naturally possible, then that would be more compelling to think that this wasn't simply psychosomatic, that there was something more veridical about this. So
that's what I'm asking about here. Is so first, healings, all of the healings are fully explained by spontaneous remission. Like all diseases that we know of have some percentage of spontaneous remission. There's never been a healing of something that has no spontaneous remission, like a limb's amputee regrowing the limb. So all of the diseases that can be fixed from biological spontaneous remission that has nothing to do with miracles are the only ones that have ever been claimed or that have ever been confirmed as actually occurring. There's been no evidence of miracles of things that haven't been explained by naturalistic causes. If there were, that wouldn't be evidence of the supernatural, though. That'd just be evidence of here's an unknown phenomenon we can't explain yet. So the two things you presented, which was someone has a vision and they get healed, both of those can be explained by naturalist stuff, and then saying that there's something that couldn't be explained by natural. Even if that was true, none of the known natural stuff, that wouldn't be evidence of the supernatural, just be an argument from ignorance. You would need to actually provide positive evidence that this was supernatural, not just say, oh, naturalism can't explain it yet.
There actually, I mean, we do have, I'm trying to think, there was one example. Actually, David Hume mentions the example in Spain in his day of a beggar who had his leg amputated, who got it back, and this was attested by the surgeons of the day and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say that we don't have any testimony of people growing limbs back that wasn't medically documented at the time. But regardless of that, I don't think that that's medically sound for his second point to say that, well, all conditions can spontaneously remit. First of all, the religious context is relevant. And secondly, there are diseases that we know that have no natural cure. For example, one would be macular degeneration, which is a form of vision impairment. And we have records, for example, of people like Greg Spencer, who was legally blind, was prayed for, instantly was able to see again, and we have his medical records, and he was on disability. The Social Security Administration investigated him for fraud, couldn't find any evidence of fraud, and said, yep, your medical records clearly show that you were completely blind and now can see again. And and they investigated him because there precisely is no cure and no evidence of remission in any other case. So if the only evidences of remission you have are in religious contexts, that would be different. And that's kind of what we have here. Same with paraplegics walking, for example. Someone who was in a wheelchair for 22 years should not have any medically precedent to suddenly start walking. But it's someone like Delia Knox's case, which is on YouTube, was prayed for and started walking. When you look into certain medical literature, it really depends on what condition you're talking about. Cancers are a better example, but even remission of cancer is a very gradual thing. If you have reports of cancer remitting within a few days after it was, stage 4 terminal, that's not something that as far as we know, is medically possible. And so you have to be careful with some of these immunological claims. And that's why I'm trying to have for, my next book, to have specialists and doctors look over some of these and people who are experts in that field and to comment on it. So it really depends. The answer to that is it really depends on the case that you're talking about and what condition it is. And secondly, as far as we would just say, well, we don't know what it is. That's true in of itself, but that's where you would have inference the best explanation. So you could say, well, either this is something that's deterministic, this is something that's like a quantum indeterminism, or this is an agent. Where we could say, well, for determinism, the fact that we don't see this elsewhere and that under controlled conditions we can't repeat this, that makes a deterministic law fairly unlikely. As far as quantum events in determinism, that's also unlikely that much would happen in this context to affect a macroscopic organism like a person in that sense. And so you could say maybe it's an agent with free will. And so then you would say, well, which agent is it? And that's when the religious context would come into play, as far as an agent who might want to heal someone, who has the ability to heal someone, and so forth. So that's kind of how I would address some of those comments.
That's Caleb Jackson from Pora, the YouTube channel. Also, you can find his books on Amazon, Undead and Searching for a Solution to Suffering. TJump from the TJump YouTube channel. You mind closing us out, sir? Just your thoughts on Caleb's last point there.
Sure. One thing is that I think it's false. I just Googled an article from ResearchGate, retinal pigments, lots of big words I can't say, which specifically just says there are cases of spontaneous remission of neurovascularization stuff, blah, 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 without the need for treatment. See citation 6, 7, 8, 13. So there are many cases of that occurring. Also, there are cases of cancer having remission very quickly that have nothing to do with visions or things like that. Like, I would agree that if the only time people ever had spontaneous remission of diseases was with a vision of Jesus or something, then yeah, I would count that as some very small evidence for sure. But it's just not the case. It's just false. Most of the cases we have are not of that, and it happens equal percentages all over the world with no visions to atheists. And the fact that Hume wrote about a testimony of someone getting their leg back doesn't make it credible. So I don't think that it actually counts as evidence, because we haven't actually demonstrated that testimony counts as evidence in the first place. So saying that Hume has some guy in Spain who had a testimony that he got his leg back doesn't count as evidence.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Robert.
Absolutely appreciate it. So I wanted to say I really appreciate you, Robert, because I've been trying to get my Discord people. I've been trying to get more people to set up debates, like to call people, to send emails, but they're all wusses. It's really hard to get people to actually set up debates. And so I really appreciate you and James and the other guys who set up debates, because that is, as something to help grow the community, that is an extremely important, valuable skill that is lacking and is extremely hard to teach people to do. So thank you.
No, I appreciate it. I agree with you. I hear so much, what's the point of these debates? What's the point? It was a major part of my leaving the faith, listening to two people talk it out, and to Team Jesus as well, Caleb. Literally, I'm sure that could help in your proselytizing and evangelism, or apostatizing. Which is it? We don't know.
Right, exactly.
All right, thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Thanks, you too, guys.
See you guys later.
1, 2.
Thank you to Caleb and Tom. Thank you to Dave Blair at DaveBlairMusic.com. Thank you to Feedspot.com for promoting the Right to Reason to the Top 10 Atheist podcast. Thank you to our patrons, Rob Schreck, $10, Larry Wilson, $8, Michael Moore, $5, Catherine Class, $5, Freethinker 215, $2, Phil Calderon, $2, and our $1 patrons, Brittany Catherman, Alan Marks, Philip Spawn, Bernard Lamberell, Anima Man, and our top supporter, Rob Montgomery. That's at $20. Holy shit. You can support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, we will be talking to the author of Death, Dying, and Disbelief, Candace Gorham. She also wrote a book titled The Ebony Exodus: Why Black Women Are Walking Out on Religion and Others Should Too. There are a multitude of topics to talk about, and if we're willing to listen, to learn about as well. That's next week. Between now and then, fight for your right to reason.
This is the Right to Reason podcast.
We have the right to reason.
You know what, guys? This is the Right to Reason.
I'm Chris Christensen, the Christian, and I approve Robert Stanley's message.